The Communicators is on location at the 7th Annual State of the Net Conference sponsored by the Internet Caucus of Congress. Joining us now is Dr. William Lehr of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he is a researcher on the Communications Futures Program. First of all, Dr. Lehr, what is the Communications Futures Program?
Communications Futures Program is an attempt to look across the value chain of the internet, so from equipment providers to service providers to application providers, and not just in the US but internationally. So we work together, several schools at MIT, with industry partners both internationally and domestically to look at various issues that are confronting the internet. And the idea is to try and think about technologically aware policy and business strategy aware technology, and sort of try and bridge that gap.
What are you thinking about most these days?
Well, with the internet there's a lot of things to think about. Me personally, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about wireless issues, and I come out of a regulatory economics research background, and so I'm especially interested in all the sort of non-technical side of like policy and business strategy and how that interacts with the internet. So, you know, how do we ensure healthy investment climate for the internet? How would we design next generation internet architectures? How might we manage the radio frequency spectrum? These sorts of issues are some of the ones I've been thinking about recently.
And we'll get into those in just a minute, but when you graduated from your first college, University of Pennsylvania, you graduated in an era of floppy disks, computer labs, and dial-up modems.
Yeah.
What did you see in the future in 1979?
You know, at the time, you know, the notion that we would be getting to something like more what we have today, I mean, there were lots of people talking about that, and if you were interested in technology, you could see it. The fact that if I had been asked at the time to make any specific predictions, the likelihood that any of those specific predictions, except the most general terms, would have been absolutely wrong, I mean, I think it's like 100%. And it wasn't just me, it was people that actually were in the business of trying to make predictions at the time. So while you could sort of read, you know, Orwell's 1984, which, you know, we couldn't have done in 1984 and we couldn't have done in 1994, but we're getting pretty damn close to being able to do in 2004. Those sorts of images and the possibility of that kind of information everywhere, know everything about you, all these sorts of things, I think people were certainly talking about.
Well, let's talk about privacy then. Privacy on the internet. Is the cow out of the barn at this point? It's too late to close the door?
Well, I mean, I think from a practical point of view, yeah, the horse is out of the barn. I've heard someone say, and I don't disagree with this, that even though the horse is like trotting out of the barn, you might want to still hang on the reins and slow it down. But I do think what it means is we've gotten to a point with the technology, and we're getting there even closer, where anybody who wants to know anything about you can, if they're willing to do it. And protecting someone's ability to know something about you is probably not feasible. We can design technologies to make that better, make it harder to use it. We need to focus on how the information is used and really reconstruct, and this is a social debate in addition to a technical debate, what about privacy do we really care about and what do we want to preserve? So I think it's a dialogue. And there's a lot of things that people don't understand. So, for example, a lot of what you want from the new technology in terms of customization, seamless behavior, self-configuration, applications just working the way I wanted them to work, depends on these people knowing lots of the applications, knowing lots of things about you, that if you knew, you may say, I'm concerned about that. I think certainly one of the first things we need to do is get people more aware of what other folks know, and disclosure, so if people understood, like, you know, what information do you know about me, and can I check that? Those are some of the, I think, the principles where you're going to get the best sort of policy initiatives to try and protect us.
Do you bank online?
I bank online and I do all this stuff online. And you know, part of it again is because I realize that one, if I were to sort of avail myself of the privacy options that I have, and that there are a lot of people at MIT, for example, that are extremely paranoid, you know, because they know, and so they do all kinds of stuff. They will not bank online, this sort of stuff. It's just too inconvenient not to do that. And one of the things I do is I'm lots of people online. So, go find the real me. I mean, I have probably 40 or 50 email addresses. If you, Google my identity in these lists, you'll find me, but you'll also find 10 versions of me that aren't me.
You talked about the fact that some of your research focuses on the regulatory environment. We're here in Washington. Generally, how would you describe the regulatory environment right now?
I think it's an environment that's in transition. I organized a workshop with international support back in 1998 on sort of focusing on, hey, we ought to be thinking about internet policy into the future. The largest sort of regulatory phenomenon that's happened in the West is the notion that markets do a better job than sort of centralized planning. The whole kind of like the Soviet Union pre-1989 bad idea, capitalism, markets, good idea. And I absolutely agree with that, and sort of the whole economics profession pretty much agrees with that with a few sort of outliers. But that's not to say no regulation. Markets are just differently regulated. And I think what we're trying to struggle through now is how to differently regulate. We're in a big transition that's ongoing from sort of all the traditional sort of media, so cable television, broadcast, telecommunications, where we're not in a position to just sort of tear that house down, that regulatory house down completely and say we want nothing there. But we haven't yet figured out how we map this to the internet, which is the new PSTN, the new essential infrastructure that we want to think about how to regulate. I'd like to see that done in a way that's responsive to market processes, but I think that means thinking that there is a role for public regulation. It's a question of how to do it. What is light-handed regulation? And it can't be no regulation. I mean, that's not realistic politically, and it's not a fact. But so I think we need to embrace that it needs to be something affirmative and think about what that is.
So is the FCC versatile and limber enough to regulate today's world?
I don't think there's any sort of perfect institution here, and there are a number of players in this space. It's a multi-stakeholder game. So, for example, the standards bodies, other sorts of quasi-market-based organizations all have a role to play, as well as international bodies. In the U.S., if I look at a regulatory authority and I say who is the one that's the most up to speed and the best position to do this, I think it has to be the Federal Communications Commission. I certainly wouldn't want to destroy the Federal Communications Commission and create something else. That having been said, I think we need to think about what is the right role for the Federal Communications Commission, and what authority should it be operating under.
What about international regulation, given the worldwideness of the net?
Well, I mean, we don't do a particularly great job of international regulation of anything, from international slave to trafficking in humans, all that sort of stuff. I don't think most of the people on the technical side are comfortable, for example, with like the UN regulating the internet. I think a lot of the people, sort of old internet hands, are pretty happy with the sort of non-governmental organizations that have done this in the past, but I think there are real questions about whether or not they scale. And all of the current sort of, if you said, okay, what's an international agency that would do this? The ITU? All you have to do is sort of say that in an industry forum amongst people that sort of understand what working with the ITU is like, and you get this like collective groan. I think the industry needs to be very proactive, because I don't think it's a reasonable position for them to take that they can essentially push off any kind of meaningful international regulation or cooperation forever. And they need to think, they need to help the people that don't want it to be something like the ITU or the UN, give them some alternatives to work with.
But when we hear from business, they ask for certainty. They ask for the rules so they can play by the rules and they know what the rules are. And the rules here in the US, there's rules in the EU, right. China, Iran.
Certainly, with regulatory uncertainty, randomness, pure randomness on the part of government behavior is a deterrent to investment, like pure randomness in almost anything is. But there's nothing that's certain, and we change things all the time. I think the notion that setting forth a framework, there are different sorts of things that could be changed. For example, the net neutrality principles that were espoused by Colin Powell. At the time, I didn't think that made a whole lot of sense, and I didn't think that actually they had a lot of teeth, and so I wasn't in favor of them. roll forward a number of years and you find that sort of those principles everybody agrees with. Nobody's come out and said that basically, people shouldn't have an access to use content that is legal, that they shouldn't be able to attach devices that wouldn't hurt the thing, that they should have choice. Those basic principles, everybody sort of accepted. The question then is, what do you do beyond that? And I think the FCC, in its December order, I think was attempting to move forward. I think that's an ongoing dialogue. I think the FCC has a role to play in it. I was sort of not terribly comfortable with the original, for example, FCC rules on non-discrimination, largely because I didn't think they were ultimately enforceable, and I think they get you into a whole lot of other problems about, they beg more questions than they answer, like, what's a specialized service, what's the internet, is interconnection part of the access? Can you regulate access without regulating interconnection? A whole bunch of other questions come up that I don't think we're in a good position politically or even technically really to sort of figure out how exactly we want to answer. So I think if you looked at those principles and you sort of said, okay, I'm not really sure what these mean, but I think I can tell you about egregious examples that everybody would say that violates these. Are there plenty of examples of gray area close to these principles that I wouldn't know how to adjudicate? Yeah. The question is, are those problems we have to deal with right now? I think the answer is no.
Dr. William Lehr, the dynamic of a Republican House of Representatives, what does that add to the regulatory debate and discussion?
Ideally, I would hope nothing, because historically communications policy has been largely nonpartisan, and I think if for example this became a partisan issue, it would be bad communications policy. If there are positive things for example, the Tea Party or the Republicans can come in and do, I think looking really hard at things like universal service reform. And there you have an $8 billion entitlement. It absolutely makes no sense to me, and to no economists that seriously look at this, for this to be an entitlement program for telephone service. The idea that you need to subsidize people's access to telephone, you don't need to do that. People will buy telephones even if they're taking food out of their kids' mouths. So if you're trying to keep people on the telephone network, then you don't need to subsidize that. If people are taking food out of their kids' mouths, that's a different problem. There are poor people out there. So you really need to think about what the nature of this program is. If you take the program and you say, I'm investing in broadband because I'm investing in something called basic infrastructure, and I'm going to move that over, does it need to be $8 billion? I seriously question that. But certainly should I refocus it? Yes, and I would hope like the Tea Party would help us think about those questions hard and say that no, just doing business as it's always been, here's an opportunity to take a big fat cow and either make it justify itself or let's cut it up and sell it as meat.
What's the next revolution in technology that you're concentrating on?
Well, there's a bunch. I mean, I think one area that I'm personally really interested in is sort of wireless, and as we really sort of integrate ubiquitous computing, but that's one step towards the next really big challenge from a policy point of view, which is, we've managed to sort of take with the internet data communications for everybody and tying computers, so everybody's on computers. And with wireless, we've said mobile, so everybody's connected everywhere, everybody's on the internet, at least in principle. Of course, they're not, and making sure that everybody is a lot of what policy's about. The next really big thing is how do we take the real world and hook it together with the cyber world? And when that happens and we start having computers and this environment, our environment, making more decisions for us, which is already happening. I mean, when you walk in a store through a door, automatic door, you lift up the hood of your car, you're seeing electronics. That means that, John Q. Public doesn't know how to fix it. It's not like, when I was in college and I could lift the hood of my car and I could badly replace a water pump. Today I look in and I go, I don't even know where the water pump is. So many, many more decisions are going to be made by computers on our behalf. And are we comfortable with how the decisions are going to be made, how the technology is being designed to implement those, where the connection points are, all this sort of stuff.
Currently, is there consistency between wireless or mobile regulation and fixed?
No, there isn't, and I think for good reason. But I think more of a harmonization, rationalization of that's going to need to happen. I think if one were to look at it right now today and say mobile broadband, fixed broadband, is that the same service, so it needs to be regulated the same way? I think the answer is no. I think there's real need for mobile broadband, which is a different service, than fixed broadband. For a big chunk of users, and especially maybe people at the bottom, they may be substitutes. They may say, if I could have both, I'd have both, and I'd get different possibly services or applications or functionality off those two services. But if I've got a short, budget, I got to make a decision, I'll choose one or the other. And some will choose fixed, and some will choose mobile. I think in the poorer people, more will choose mobile.
William Lehr is a researcher with the Communications Futures Program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thank you for being on the Communicators.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
Author and CNET columnist Larry Downs is also participating at the State of the Net conference sponsored by the Congressional Internet Caucus. Mr. Downs, in your most recent book, the title is The Laws of Disruption. Where did that title come from?
It actually came from work I did several years ago where I started looking at how technology and business interacted with each other. And one of the things I realized was that as technological change, or what we sometimes call disruptive technology, got faster and more disruptive, the ability of businesses and now the ability of consumers to respond as quickly as the technology makes possible was getting further and further apart. And the gap that was created between the speed of technology and the speed of change was causing all this disruption.
What's an example of disruptive technology?
Well, of course, the one we're all talking about here is the internet. That's probably been the most disruptive technology of the last 50 to 100 years. It's sort of on par with the steam engine in the early industrial age. It's very it's supplanted many network technologies that people thought were, very well established. All
Such
of a sudden,
as?
well, like IBM had SNA and DEC had DECnet, and there were all these proprietary networking technologies that kept things in very compartmentalized, rigid boxes, all of course completely focused on business. Along comes the internet, not intending to be even a commercial technology, let alone a consumer technology, but because of its openness, because it was not owned by anybody, it became the least common denominator standard, and everything took on the internet as its networking standard. And of course, as we know, it's turned businesses upside down. It's changed the nature of consumers and businesses, changed the nature of citizens and their governments. It's been remarkably disruptive.
Are apps disruptive?
Yes, I think apps is kind of, I think of that as the next wave of this transition. I wrote a book in 1998 called Unleashing the Killer App. That time we were talking about websites, and websites were in very early stages then. Well, now, of course, what's really causing the disruption are these much, much smaller pieces of software, mostly running on mobile devices, pads and phones and other kinds of things. And the app economy, I think, is going to be the next big wave of how the internet disrupts traditional ways of doing business.
What are you doing here at the State of the Net conference?
Well, many years ago, I started to realize that the way in which governments interact, some would say interfere, with how disruptive technologies work could have a big impact on how quickly things got adapted or how well they got adapted. And I started advising my clients to not pay so much attention to their lawyers, but to actually engage themselves in understanding how policy was being debated about core technologies that their business relied on, and making sure that they understood not just the technologies, but how government may or may not interfere. That was the only way really to be effective in making sure the right kinds of laws got made or didn't get made, as the case may be.
What's your general philosophy when it comes to federal regulation of the internet, of technology, of Silicon Valley, et cetera?
Well, my general view, and it only applies to what I've described as disruptive technologies, is because of their very nature, how quickly they spread, the ways in which they take on new uses that nobody expected or intended, it makes a very, very poor fit for government in general. Government obviously is very deliberative. By design, it's very slow and methodical. When you're kind of trying to regulate a speedboat while you're standing on the dock, the results are almost always bad. And so as a sort of a general rule, I think regulating disruptive technologies generally leads to bad and unintended consequences that nobody wants and nobody would want if they only knew what was going to happen.
What is CNET?
CNET is CBS Interactive. It's a network that's focused on technology and technology policy in my case. The readership is largely a technical readership or people who are interested in latest and greatest new devices and gadgets.
So you're a columnist for CNET, but what is your day job? What is your main business?
Well, what I principally do is I'm a consultant. That's what I've always been. It's moved from doing what I used to do, which was more strategy consulting, helping companies figure out how these disruptive technologies were going to change their supply chains or their business relationships or who their customers were or what their products were. Over the last couple of years, it's moved, I think, because of the way the world has changed, much more into how do policy decisions, court cases, regulations, potential new laws, both US and globally, how do those affect strategy and what do proactively about them to make sure that business can continue and indeed to expand regardless of what's happening on the policy front.
What technologies aren't disruptive?
Well, you know, the basic distinction between a disruptive technology and an incremental technology is very hazy. But, you know, we think of things like, the next release of the operating system, the sort of, you know, an upgrade to your existing product, you know, from one year's TurboTax to the next, generally not really very disruptive. One version of the iPhone to the next, largely incremental. These are things that I think consumers in particular can adapt very quickly, but you know, when a tablet computer suddenly arrives, it's got new uses. We don't really even know what metaphors to apply to it. We don't know what to call it. You know, is this a book? Is this a computer? It's kind of like when the car came out and we refer to it as a horseless carriage because, you know, we didn't know what it really was. When you have one of those, then it's a disruptive technology.
In the next X number of months or years, what do you see as the next big disruptive technology?
Well, the mobile revolution will continue, and it will be coupled with this movement from sort of isolated data activities to what's known as the cloud, where both our data and our processing, and again, this is both from a business and a consumer standpoint, more and more of it moves off of our individual devices and into this cloud, this network of computers and different service providers and different kinds of companies who will manage it for us, who will provide services with it. Those two put together is really creating a remarkable opportunity for businesses to be global overnight, for consumers to connect and do things, not only business things, but also social things immediately and on a scale unprecedented in previous history.
Does it matter, Larry Downs, where those clouds are located?
Well, it shouldn't from a technology standpoint. Of course, technology doesn't care. The beauty of the internet is that it routes according to traffic. And if the traffic is bad in DC, it goes to Milan. If it's bad in Milan, it goes to Jakarta. But of course, the reality is that governments, both national and in some kinds even local governments, have an interest in activities, and they like to decide that, well, if it's passing through here, all of our laws, some of our laws apply to it, and businesses are often surprised to discover that just because the data may have transitorily gone through one location, a whole set of laws they know nothing about apply to it.
So how far have we moved ahead with when it comes to cloud computing? I mean, it's been shifting in that direction.
Yes.
Do you see it going 90, 100% that way? And how far have we gone so far?
It's hard to say how far we've gone. I mean, certainly for mobile users, and of course increasingly computing is a mobile experience in terms of both the device and the fact that it's untethered, it's wireless, it's wherever we happen to be. For people who are mobile users, it's almost entirely cloud-based. Almost everything you have is cloud-based. You buy an Amazon Kindle, well, some of the books you'll store locally, but really your library is out there in the cloud. And that's you know, makes a lot of sense from both a business standpoint and of course from the standpoint of just how much stuff you can keep on a device at any given time. This is a good development. And I think because mobile computing is where everything is moving to, the idea of the cloud as the place where the processing and the storage and everything else happens goes right along with that. So I'd say in the next 10 years, I mean, of course, local storage will never go away, local processing would never completely go away, but the cloud is clearly the architecture that most people in the industry believe is what we'll do in the next few years.
How smart is technology?
Smart. Technology is only as smart as the engineers who create it. You know, it doesn't have any brains on its own. Fortunately, you know, we live in an age of tremendous engineering talent, obviously in the US, but really around the world, and the ability to bring that talent together whenever we need to for short-term, long-term kinds of projects. That's, I think, what's driven this acceleration of disruptive technologies is, you know, the engineers are there and we can bring them to bear on a task whenever we need them to, regardless of where they happen to be in the physical sense.
Larry Downs, do your clients understand Washington, and vice versa? Does Washington understand your client?
No. No to both. Silicon Valley has a genetic defect that it just believes if you don't pay attention to the government, it will go away, or it won't interfere, it just won't be there. And I very much face an uphill battle in trying to convince them that increasingly, as more and more economic activity, as more and more social activity moves to the cloud, it's natural that governments of all levels are going to become more interested in what goes on there. And so the idea that there's going to be more regulation of all varieties of the technologies that my clients build is inevitable. It's very hard to convince them of that. Of course, on the other side, convincing regulators, which I sometimes try to do as well, that they don't really understand technology, or they don't understand, I'd say, the speed with which it's changing and the speed with which it will continue to change, and its unpredictability, that doesn't go down very well in Washington.
You recently wrote about the spectrum.
Yes.
Very heavily regulated piece of, well, not technology, but part of the technological world. At what level should it be freed up or unregulated in your view?
Well, there's always been a, some would say a fairly good balance between the regulated part of the spectrum and the unregulated part of the spectrum. I don't think anyone's being particularly critical of that. We all agree, and certainly the FCC from the chairman on down, understand that the mobile computing environment is growing so quickly and it requires more spectrum. Obviously, spectrum is a limited quantity. There's no real solution to that. We can make it more efficient. We can be better about sharing it and using it in creative ways through technology, and there'll certainly be a lot of that. But the fact of the matter is we have a tremendous amount of radio frequency that we don't even know who's got the license to it. We have every reason to believe it's not being used very well or not being used at all. And it's absolutely imperative that we first and foremost understand where we are now, what is the map of the spectrum allocations, but then very quickly afterwards start looking for ways of getting the underutilized, unvalued spectrum back on the market so that the best possible uses, in this case mobile internet, mobile communicating, can continue to grow at the pace it is, because everyone I think agrees that we're about to hit a hard stop. It may be in 5 years, it may be in 10 years, but without more spectrum for mobile computing, the revolution in progress will not be able to continue.
If people are interested in reading your columns, where can they go?
They can go to news.www.news.com, the CNET website, and also to my own website, where I also write about some of these things in more detail than anybody would possibly want to read.
And what's your website?
It's www.larrydowns.com.
Larry Downs, author and CNET columnist, thank you for being on the Communicators.
Thank you very much.
The Senate